This question of truth is really quite important in moral questions or in establishing moral arguments, moral understandings, and that's one of the reasons why we're taking a bit more care to be very careful with our understanding of what truth is. One of the common objections or common positions these days is that there is no standard one-size-fits-all truth. It's rather that I have my truth that I produce or someone produces and gives me in some way, and you might have your truth and you might produce it or somebody else might produce it and give it to you. And this idea of the production of truth is an unusual idea but an extremely common one. And so I want to get us to think about whether it's possible for my truth and your truth to really exist if truth is the conformity of statements to reality. Let's look now at this question of, can there be multiple truths? Let's look at a situation where we have two different people both perceiving the same phenomena. Okay, we have two people looking at a tree here. From one side of the tree, the person observes it and says, the tree has no apples. From the other side of the tree, the person observes it and says, the tree has 2 apples. My position might be 2 apples, your position might be no apples, and so there appears to be multiple truths there. It's certainly true for you from your perspective, because you're on the treeless side of the appleless side of the tree. Likewise, there's no doubt about my perception being true as well. Are there multiple truths? Well, we don't have to think about this too long to see that really the fact that we have two different true perceptions does not mean that we necessarily have a grasp of the truth of the tree, at least in terms of the number of apples in it. We have two statements of perception. At best, one of the statements about the tree is true. We don't have multiple truths. We simply have multiple opinions about the tree, because both my opinion and yours, you thinking there's no apples, me thinking there's 2, are in fact both wrong. They're not actually knowledge of the tree, because if I had a thorough investigation of the tree, I'd find out that reality is different from what both of us were about. And to a certain extent, this is what happens in reality. I might think one thing because of limited information, you might think of another, and the development of scientific understanding comes from looking more closely at the reality to resolve the apparent difficulty and find out what is really going on. This is the kind of terminology we use. We don't sit back and simply accept multiple realities or multiple truths, even though we often try and talk like that when it suits us in moral dialogue. Let's look at some logic for truth. Perceptions are meant to conform to reality. Where perceptions differ, only one thing can be known, and that is that most perceptions must be wrong. And isn't this true of the history of our scientific endeavours? There were thousands of years when we thought that the way that the heavenly bodies work, the stars and the moon and so on, was quite different to what was really going on, even though the perceptions seemed to suit the theories. We can say that one perception may be right, but it doesn't necessarily mean that any particular perception is, or could be, true. It does mean that we have good cause to look at the matter in a bit more depth, to get to the reality of the matter. What is really going on? What is true? Science is about resolving perceptual errors and getting true statements of reality. And so if we have a third person with maybe a different perspective comes along and makes that statement, maybe they've crawled up in the tree and looked at it exhaustively, that is a true statement in this case, and hopefully they will communicate that with us and we will be brought closer to the truth, meaning that our truth, my truth and your truth, were not truths at all. We then move to the question of, can objective truth exist? Some statements relate to transient and subjective things like today's weather or my feelings or one's cultural norms. A true value relates to specified validity. A truth of a statement about the world may change, like what the weather is or something like that, due to changes in the world, not actually due to changes in the truth. Changes in the world comes back to what we started off by talking about as the way that truth has to be correctly specified. Most statements that are really important relate to forms. In other words, the design of things, the relationships. There are people in this room. I exist. You are listening to a very boring talk about truth and perception and ethics and whatnot. This circle is square is a statement which, one way or another, talks about the way things are. It turns out that it's very hard for a circle to be square, and so the one thing I know about this green statement is that it is not true. It cannot be true as much as you or I or anyone else might want it to be. True values relate to accuracy, and they are objective. There is no objective truth is a curious statement. Many people believe it. At one stage I did a survey of my students, and I found that something like, a sizable minority believed that there could be no objective truth. I thought that was rather unfortunate and more than a little bit pessimistic. It would mean that one way or another you couldn't even say, is it true that you are answering the question, is there objective truth? It all becomes a bit silly. And if you think enough about this statement, which by the way is a very popular statement, you'll find that it's actually a paradox. It's impossible to say it, because if it is true, then it is false. When we look at history, there is a perception that we cannot know anything truly in history. Many of you have been through the high school history curriculum, and you've been taught to look at different sources as though there are always different perspectives in history, and there's really not a lot of point in trying to see what really happened, because all you have is the view of the winners or the view of the losers. The idea of what really happened, well, who knows? Again, that's a rather pessimistic view, because it means that history is nothing more than some exercise in public relations or coercion or something. The winners trying to justify their oppression, the losers trying to get a shoulder to cry on, and the real human interest, which is to solve puzzles and get to the bottom of the matter, is kind of lost in the middle. The reality is that we can know what happened. I can know with truth, in truth, what I had for breakfast. You can probably tell me what you had for breakfast, and we're exchanging truth. We can do that with major events as much as we can do it with minor, trivial events. History is often selective. It's often written by the winners. Sometimes it's written by the losers. But one way or another, a distorted history is not really a history at all. The real object of history is conformity of the story to reality. And doesn't that come back to the definition of truth that we started with somewhat earlier? What we can see from our reflections on history is that common sense tells us that there must have been something that really happened. There must be some objective account that could be told which does accurately represent the reality of history. And this is the same with all ethical deliberation. We're not talking about personal preferences or opinions. We're talking about the reality of various situations that have ethical consequences. And so we can say that ethics is closely related to truth. It relies on knowing the truth about human nature. And that is really the basis of ethics. So we're looking for statements about humanity that conform to what exists. The practice of ethics needs some objectively true reference points. There's no point in trying to have a society fit together where everybody has their own opinions on what should be right or wrong. And then, of course, we need prudence in the application for practical situations. And this is where a certain amount of personal decision making may come in. But it's the practical interpretation of pure moral facts or moral relationships, moral principles, that is really the practical side of ethics. The principles must be objective. They must be found, while the judgments are subjective. And then ultimately, the subjective is circumscribed. So in other words, it means that it operates within the objective framework.